everyone. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Berman, as usual. Today, I am joined once again by Dr. Richard Carrier. And today, we're going to be talking about his Bayesian analysis for the historical Jesus. The likelihood that he did exist versus the likelihood that he didn't exist. And why he thinks that it is more likely that he didn't exist versus the likelihood that he did exist. So that takes me to my first question. What led you to the conclusion, using Bayesian probability, that the historical Jesus is unlikely to exist with a 2/3 probability that he didn't exist versus a 1/3 chance that he did exist? You also say in your book on the historicity of Jesus that you are actually being generous by saying there's a 1/3 chance that it's probably worse, or that it actually is worse.
Yeah. Well, there's two questions in there, right? It's like, where did I first get the idea of doing Bayesian approach to this? And then the other is, how did I get that result? Right?
Yeah.
That's the first stage. I had basically a fan grant funded postdoc research program on this, right? So, and the first step, whenever you do anything like that, is methodology. So you got to work out what is your methodology before you approach. And I had already noticed, I had been avidly studying historical methodology in graduate school. So it was one of the things that I knew a lot about already. And I've noticed that the methods that were being employed in Jesus studies were either bogus or misapplied. And so I couldn't use that. And incidentally, I looked at all the studies of the methodologies applied to Jesus, and all of the studies specifically of the methodologies concluded the same thing. These methods don't work, or you're using them wrong. And I was like, well, great. No, just so happens at the same time, I was actually quite anti-Bayesian. There was a movement to try and get Bayesian methodology into apologetics, Christian apologetics, and counter-apologetics. And there was a research team that was developing a Bayesian argument against the supernatural resurrection. And I'm actually, at that point, I was like one of the world's leading experts on resurrection apologetics. I've published widely on it, know a lot about it. And I was like arguing with them on email. And I was like, no, this is a stupid method. It could never work. And they were arguing back. There's more, it was a scholarly argument, but still, between us. But there came a moment when I was going to respond, and I realized, holy shit, I'm wrong. Right? Like when you have that moment, it's like, no, fuck, this is actually they're absolutely right. And I misunderstood it this whole time. I misunderstood what was going on. And then it clicked for me where I could see at once, like, all the valid methodologies are really just Bayesian under the hood, right? So if you pop the hood on any methodology you apply, if it's a valid methodology, underneath it is Bayes' theorem. And so once I had that revelation, and this occurred roughly around the same time I was doing the methodology study for my postdoc, so I decided, well, yeah, let's do that. And then, so I had to first come out with a book showing the methodology. So that was Proving History, and that's peer-reviewed. A professor of mathematics and professor of biblical studies peer-reviewed it. I required that in my contract with Prometheus Books. And that is where I take all the traditional methods, including all the ones that use Jesus studies that were weird, and did a Bayesian analysis of all of them, showing how they work, when they don't work, and so on. And that made it much easier to actually get at what in history is most of the time gut feeling. You often can't really tell what the logical structure is of a historian's argument. They'll make a lot of assertions like this is probable or this is implausible or whatever. But even if they provide evidence to like back up that claim, and often they won't, even if they do, you don't see how that relates to the conclusion. Right. So you never see historians work out the actual logic. And I'm not the first one to notice this. David Hackett Fisher. I think his name is David Hackett Fisher, but Hackett Fisher, he's most famous for Albion Seed, which is this huge voluminous history of the United States, or early settling of the United States, and development of language and stuff. But he also wrote a book called Historians' Fallacies, and this huge book where he goes through multiple fields of history and finds in major peer-reviewed, like serious, even revered historical works, and finds tons of fallacies just being blatantly accepted. Just you just fly right by them, and they're just there all over history. It's kind of humorous because he finds a lot of it's a good book. I recommend people read it, but because it covers so many fields and finds so many examples of these fallacies, and he shows it happening multiple times, and he explains the fallacy. There's a lot of wittiness in it, and in the end, he says like, well, it's clear there must be some sort of logic governing valid historical reasoning, and no one's figured out what it is, but hopefully someday we will. And I feel like that's what I found was Bayes' theorem is actually the underlying logic, the engine that everything else runs on, whether you're aware of it or not. I think even all historians are relying on it, even if they don't realize they are. And then, after I published that book, I found out that someone else had come to the same conclusion as me, and that was Aviezer Tucker. Wrote, and he's a philosophy of history. He wrote a book on the exact same things. The underlying methodology behind, the underlying logic behind all historical reasoning is Bayesian. And he had this whole book. So we came to the same conclusion independently of each other, which is always a good sign that we're probably onto something. So that's how I came to have the confidence in Bayesian epistemology, which I've extended beyond history. I think I can do counter apologetics now much more competently. I can do philosophy now much more competently now that I understand Bayesian structure and Bayesian logic, because I can very easily find the flaws in certain arguments and then figure out how, if it's possible, to make them much stronger, make them better arguments. So then I applied it. And so that took, the total of all this took 6 years, so from beginning of the project to the end. And then the final, the two books, 2012 was Proving History. 2014, I had two books. One was Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, that had some of my peer-reviewed journal articles that I produced in the process of this. And then, of course, the big book on the historicity of Jesus, which is the huge academic peer-reviewed treatise on this. And since then, I've done the colloquial short version, which is Jesus from Outer Space. But in the big one that I did get accepted at a Biblical Studies Press, had multiple peer reviewers, some that I had peer reviewed before I even submitted it to the journal, and then the journal also had their own people, and so I went through a lot of vetting. And so, so the end result was that once you start thinking in terms of probabilities, so you have to answer two questions: like, why are you saying something is probable, and how probable do you mean? And then why do you mean that? Like, what are you basing that on? Are you just making it up, or is there how are you driving these probabilities? The second question is, what do those probabilities tell you about the conclusion? How do you get from A to B, from premises to conclusion when they're probabilities? You can't use straightforward syllogistic logic. If anybody's tried to do this, you'll realize you get counterintuitive results. It becomes illogical. Adding evidence reduces the probability because you're adding, if you take the straightforward list of premises, say each one is 80% likely, the net probability of all of them being likely drops. It doesn't go up, it goes down. And so standard syllogistic logic doesn't make any sense of evidence. The probability should go up if you're adding evidence. So, Bayes' theorem solves this problem. It explains why the evidence goes up, because you're looking at a ratio of two probabilities, not the raw probability itself. And that's how likely is this evidence given the theory? How likely is this evidence given the theory is false, which means given some other cause of that evidence? And then you relate the ratio of the prior probabilities of those two explanations of the evidence. And so you have those two things and you get the odds form, which is really simple. Prior probability times likelihood ratio equals final probability. And that's it. Or final odds, I should say. So anyway, that's what I do on the historicity of Jesus. So the rest is the nuts and bolts of where do these things come from? And I find some things that I think a lot of people don't read the book, right? So they don't know what I've done actually. So to take an example, the epistles, I think, are on my own feeling, I think those are the best evidence against the historicity of Jesus. But on the a fortiori side, on the upper bound of my margin of error, I actually count them as evidence for the historicity of Jesus by trying to stretch, the degree to which I can, credibly believe the claims of historicists as to how we're supposed to interpret certain passages in the epistles. But the epistles are weirdly silent about the historicity of Jesus and seem to say that the only information anybody had came from Scripture and Revelation. There's no discussion anywhere in the epistles of eyewitnesses or eyewitness testimony or past oral lore passed down from eyewitnesses. None of that exists in there. No discussion of the life of Jesus, no discussion of his ministry, no discussion of parables, no sharing of his parables. They don't exist, apparently. They have no function in the teaching of Christianity. So there's a lot of really odd things about the epistles that I think when you add them up, the most straightforward explanation is that this started as a revelatory cult and became historicized later, as tons of other religions did. People think that's crazy, but no, that was actually a very common process back then. So that's one other thing I found out is like there were tons of these celestial deities that were turned into historical deities. Like that was a fashion at the time. That was happening all over the place. So there's actually nothing unusual about that process. So once you see it in that context, you can see it in that way. But I still count it on the a fortiori side, on the upper bound of my margin, where I count it as evidence for the historicity of Jesus. It's just not enough evidence. The evidence is too weak. And we can get into the nuts and bolts of why I think it's too weak in there. When you compare it to everything else. So like the first narratives we have of Jesus, in fact, the only narratives we have of Jesus are outright mythographies. They're totally mythologized, basically fables of, this ridiculously unbelievable teacher who did miraculous things, converted people with 2 sentences. It's all sorts of things that don't make sense historically. Clearly hagiography. And hagiography is infamous for being highly ahistorical. And when you look at all the people in the ancient world who were heavily mythologized, as heavily mythologized as Jesus, put them all into a hat, there aren't a lot of historical people in there. In fact, there's only about 1 out of 3, roughly, at best. Actually, the real frequency is much lower, but even at best, you don't get more than 1 in 3 are historical. So when you have a really heavily mythologized person like this right out of the gate, it's not like we had memoirs, like personal memoirs, and then hagiographies. This hagiographies a lifetime later, immediately before the first narratives we got. So that sequence of events actually supports the non-existence of Jesus. So if you put those two things together, you end and you throw a few pieces of evidence, like in the epistles, that I think that if you put on the upper bound margin of error, that you could try to argue events historicity, even with all the best evidence you can throw in there, you still don't get better than 1 in 3. And then once you realize, as I believe, that even the evidence that historicists count from the epistles as evidence for historicity, that I also count as evidence for historicity, don't really. They're actually terrible. It's the worst evidence for historicity. And so on the lower bound, I'm much below 1 in 3 on the historicity of Jesus. Now I do waffle back and forth sometimes. Sometimes I feel like, am I crazy? So I do stretch. Try to get myself in the head of someone seeing a convincing historicism and see, like, does this make sense? And so I do waffle between where I am in that margin of error, but I do lean myself personally. I lean below 1 in 3. But I don't see any objective, reasonable case to be made that it's higher than 1 in 3. And what I did in the book is I put all the probabilities down and the charts to show the math. So if you want to challenge this, you know what to do. I even have a section in chapter 12 about this is how you can challenge this. This is how you can find out if I've got the probabilities wrong. No one's done that. Everybody just ignores what I wrote in the book and then just goes to standard apologetics and just ignores what was actually in the book and then just tries to argue for historicity. And I've tried very hard to argue or explain to people, don't do that. No, go here, follow this model, and then tell me what's wrong with the model. And if you can't find anything wrong with the model, then why do we think there's anything wrong with the model? And so that's where it left us. And I'm sure there's a zillion little side tricks that we could go on related to that.
So when we look at the Gospels, which gives us 4 different biographies of Jesus, with Matthew, Luke, and John being dependent on Mark, and then Luke being dependent on Matthew and Mark, and John being dependent on the rest. I remember that in your book on the historicity of Jesus, you've gone through the parallels, an extensive list of parallels between a character in Josephus called Jesus ben Ananus to Mark's Jesus. And there's quite a lot of parallels. So could you go for that, please?
Yeah. So this is in the literature, right? This isn't something I discovered myself. Actually, there's a lot of stuff in the book like this I just found sitting in the peer-reviewed literature already that people just weren't paying attention to. Several scholars independently of each other discovered this pattern where in Mark's organization of the crucifixion narrative, it has a story arc, a narrative arc. Well, he fills it in with his own specific details, but the arc itself has a peculiar structure that exactly matches the story of a different Jesus. Now, it can't be the Jesus who started Christianity, because this is a Jesus who lived and died in the 60s AD.
Right.
So this is something that no one would have associated with Jesus and Christianity until decades after the religion started. But clearly Mark found this other story, liked it for whatever reason, and decided to structure his crucifixion narrative to match that narrative, and then filled in all the specifics with scriptural details, gospel details, things that he wants to teach, symbolism, and so on. And then logical narrative developments, right? So that's what Mark seems to have done. So other scholars have noticed this. It was Jesus ben Ananias' narrative is in Josephus' Jewish War. And this is one of the examples where it looks pretty clear that Mark is using the Jewish War of Josephus as a base text, which means that Mark had to be after 75 or 76 AD, based on this principle. And Mark doesn't appear to be using anything in the Antiquities, whereas Luke does. So now we have, like, Luke, we know, is after 93 because Luke is using the Antiquities when it was published in 93, the Jewish Antiquities of Josephus. But Mark gets the Ananias story, Jesus ben Ananias story from Jewish War, and it has 20 narrative points that are a lot of peculiar things that happen in a specific order. And the odds of all that happening by chance are not high. So you have to conclude that there's got to be some sort of borrowing and modeling going on here. Even if there's a historical Jesus, that's the case, right? So even if there's a real Jesus, Mark still chose to model his story of the crucifixion of Jesus after this other Jesus, and his narrative as told by Josephus. And it's 20 points of peculiar detail in the right order, all the same in both texts. And I show the charts, it's all, and I cite the scholarship, it's all on the historicity of Jesus in chapter 10, section 4.
Another thing that you talk about is the Yom Kippur, and that Jesus Barabbas and Jesus Christ both appearing before Pilate. One gets released and the other is crucified, kind of like one lamb is sacrificed and the other lamb is released to bear the sins of Israel. Now, Jesus ben Ananias is brought before Governor Albinus around 63 AD, and then he gets released. Now, what's interesting about that to me is that there is a previous scholar that did look at that, and he compared it to Barabbas and him getting released. That was Professor Eisman's comparison. Is it possible that the two Jesuses imitating the Yom Kippur in the Gospels is also based on Jesus ben Ananias getting released at the same time? Or is that or maybe
I'm not sure I follow you, because Jesus ben Ananias, that happened in the 60s. The Jesus Christ story, the Gospel Jesus story, has to have happened in the 30s,
right?
Because Pontius Pilate was dead decades before Jesus ben Ananias came around.
Oh, that right, of course. What I'm asking is, could they have gotten the idea to name Barabbas Jesus in some sort of
I see.
parallel?
I think a lot of people don't know what you're just describing. So in most Bibles today, they don't have Jesus Barabbas, but actually in a lot of manuscripts it says Jesus Barabbas. And it's funny, I found that out after I found the link between Barabbas means son of the Father, by the way. So the name Barabbas. So you've got Barabbas, the son of the Father. You've got Jesus, son of the Father, undergoing the exact same Yom Kippur scenario. So it's the Yom Kippur, you have to have two identical goats. One, all the sins of Israel are cast into, and it's thrown into the wilderness and eventually thrown off a cliff to kill it. And then the other is pure and innocent, and its blood is shed and falls on the altar, and then it atones for all the sins of Israel. And so the Yom Kippur, and it's another example where there were multiple scholars in the peer-reviewed literature over 100 years independently discovered this without knowing about each other. And then I did too. And then I did research to see if there was something to this. And then I found all that previous literature. And so I cited all in there. It's been discovered multiple times. Lots of scholars have noticed it. Origen himself in the 3rd century also discusses it. He's as plain as day. So it was definitely clear that's what Mark is doing. He's inventing Barabbas. This is a fictional person. And we have some manuscripts of Matthew that it's Jesus Barabbas. So you have two Jesuses, son of the fathers. So you have Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, son of the Father. I mean, come on, you can't even get more obvious that what you're doing here. And so there have been some scholars who have suggested that the Markan manuscripts originally said Jesus Barabbas. That's why the Matthew ones do, because there's only two ways Jesus could have crept in as the name of Barabbas. One is it was always there, and it dropped out in the Markan manuscripts. Or Matthew recognized what Mark was doing and thought it wasn't obvious enough. And so he decided to add the name Jesus to make it even more obvious that this is a whole allegory for the Yom Kippur. Either of those is possible. I don't have a particular preference as to what's more likely. I lean towards the "it was always there" thing, but it doesn't matter, because even when the name was there or not, the structure is plain as day, so you can't get around it, and multiple scholars agree with that point. We've given two examples now of how Mark is fictionalizing his narrative to make symbolic points. And obviously on the historicity of Jesus, I do this pericope after pericope after pericope throughout all of the Gospels to just show like this is what the authors of the Gospels are doing. It's not history. Now that in and of itself doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist, because you could have a core actual guy who got a movement started and then all this mythology built up around him. They could have completely made up the stories for their soteriological, their gospel purposes, the message they wanted to send. That doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist. What I find is that it slightly increases the probability it didn't exist, is that this is what we get right out of the gate. There's no narratives for the first lifetime, about 40 years. So any adult who was alive in Jesus' time would probably statistically be dead before the Gospels get written. And then the first narratives we get are these wildly mythologized narratives. And when we look at all comparable people like that, where we have these massive mythologizations of these savior heroes, they usually don't exist. So we need evidence that for a particular one to be an exception to the trend. And so we need better evidence that Jesus existed. And that's where we don't find any. So we would expect to find good evidence in the epistles of Paul, but we don't. We conspicuously don't find it there. And we have no other where to go to find the evidence. So that's why it's important to say, like, so I have margin of error here. There's a lot of uncertainties. But it's important to say, like, even if we top out at 1 in 3, that's still 1 in 3, right? It's 33% chance there was a guy. So you can't say that I'm declaring absolutely there was no Jesus. There could have been. It's just the evidence that we have kind of leans in the other direction. And I was surprised, actually, to find that. I did not expect that to be the case. I was hoping that there would be something I could build a good sound case for the historicity of Jesus for, as I've done for multiple other historical people, because people always come and challenge me with, well, what about Hannibal? Well, what about Spartacus? And I go, okay, let's look at those. And so I apply the same methodology and get completely different results. It's because we just don't have the data for Jesus that we do for Hannibal, for Spartacus, and so on. Let me get rid of this phone that's bugging us. So when you compare, and this is what I did in Jesus from Outer Space. I have a whole chapter where I show let's determine the historicity of all these other figures and see how we do that. Why are we confident that there was a Hannibal? It's a good question. I think it's a valid question. It's worth going into. And so I go into it. And how are we confident that Pilate existed, and so on. And then I have another chapter. Let's compare that to Jesus. Well, it's not the same. So we don't have the evidence for Jesus that we have for all these other people. Socrates, for example. We have way more evidence for Socrates than we do for Jesus. And that is a little weird. A little weird for someone so important who was written about so early. Like, you have the letters of Paul within 20 years of his life. So anyway, that's kind of the gist of how I ended up where I am. But you notice with those two examples you've given already, we can see the trend in the Gospels is not towards memoirs. These are not the recollections of eyewitnesses. This isn't, insofar as it's oral lore at all, which I don't think it is. It's lore that was told for a purpose other than preserving history. The stories serve an educational function. They don't really attempt to archive something that really happened.
Is it possible, and this was part of my original question, is it possible that Barabbas, the reason why he was called Jesus, has something to do with Jesus Bananas getting released by Governor Albinus?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So here we would have, it's the author of Mark that we're asking about. And we know he saw the Jesus Ben Ananias story. He knows that Albinus is the procurator, not Pontius Pilate in that particular story. So did this give Mark the idea of having a second Jesus who gets released, a Jesus Barabbas? That's an intriguing hypothesis. I don't see any evidence for it, because the role of Barabbas in Mark is exactly the opposite of Jesus ben Ananias. So Jesus ben Ananias, clearly Mark sees Jesus Christ as ben Ananias, right? Because he sees him as the guy who was preaching woe to Jerusalem. He was unfairly treated. The procurator didn't want to punish him, but the Jews insisted he do. And so all of this stuff is for him explaining, it's a good model for his Jesus. Whereas Barabbas is a murderer and a rebel. He's actually, no, I mean, literally says he was convicted of murder in the rebellion. So he's literally a rebel and a murderer, which I think, I mean, that's not Jesus ben Ananias, obviously. Right. And it's deeply ironic for Pilate to let a murderer and a rebel go free, and this guy who didn't do jack all gets crucified. Like, that makes no sense as history, right. But it's really elegant as irony, and Mark loved irony. So if you're writing fiction, it's great. But murder and rebellion are key because those are the two, like, in a sense, like the golden rule is supposed to be the foundation of all the 10 commandments, or of all the commandments, or actually all the commandments. If you look at like Hillel, it says, love your neighbor as yourself, or treat your fellow man as you would have him treat you, or don't treat him as you wouldn't want them to treat you, etc. That is, everything else is commentary, right? So like all the law can go down to that thing. In the same way, sin can be reduced to two things: this murderousness, Cain and Abel, famous example, murder, and rebellion. Rebellion against God, rebellion against the law, and so on. And so Barabbas definitely symbolizes all the sins of Israel, like the character in the story does. So it's brilliant fiction, completely implausible history. But I don't think that's where it comes from in Mark's case. I don't think he's getting the Barabbas idea from Jesus ben Ananias.
So the next question is, how do we know that the rulers of the age in 1 Corinthians were actually referenced to demons? Because some people will say, oh, it doesn't really say that. And
it doesn't, right? So that's a valid question. For people who don't know what we're talking about, there's a line in Paul, 1 Corinthians 2, where he says, basically says, if the rulers of this aeon had known what God's plan was, basically, they wouldn't have crucified Jesus. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in this sentence. One of them is rulers of this aeon is a weird phrase. Why not say Romans? Why not say Jews? Why say rulers of this aeon? That's really bizarre. And we have a lot of evidence outside the Bible that this is a common phrase and understanding for the great powers, the spiritual powers who control the universe, demons, Satan and his demons, basically. There's a lot of scholarship on this. I cite it all in the book for people who want to see. Other scholars have done the studies. Even Origen, again, admits this. He says that that's a phrase referring to the demonic powers. I think Origen tries to double interpret it and say, well, it refers to the demonic powers, but it's through their role in influencing the earthly powers that the crucifixion is affected. So it's kind of like adding this layer of apologetics. It's not in Paul, but Origen needs to do it. But at least it shows that Origen recognizes the phrase as being referring to cosmic powers, not earthly powers. When Paul refers to earthly powers, he doesn't say rulers of this aeon. He just says rulers. And it's in this particular context. But added to that is the fact that Paul says that if these rulers knew what the sacrifice of Jesus would do, meaning it would save all mankind or allow escape from death, they would have stopped it. Now, there's no way the Romans would have done that. And there's no way the Jews would have done that. And I explain why in Jesus from Outer Space. I have a little bit on this where I'm explaining it doesn't make any sense. Like the Romans, for one thing, wouldn't believe any of that anyway. They said, well, they're not going to use that as an excuse not to kill the guy. They're going to kill him anyway. So you have to, whoever wrote that sentence, or Paul in this case, must have thought that, like, if they're writing about Romans, they would have to think that the Romans actually understand the secret cosmic physics of the universe intended by God, and actually were consciously in league with Satan trying to keep death in the world, which is not a plausible narrative at all. And it goes against Romans 13, right? Because Paul outright says the authorities, you should obey them, they are of God. They can't do anything against God's will. So that's the earthly authorities. So, so it can't mean that. And that even the Jewish theologians who would understand the esoteric nature of the sacrifice of God's Son and all that, they wouldn't stop it either, because they'd realize, oh, this is great. This is what we need. This is how we bring about the end of the world and save the universe. exactly like the first Christians were doing, who were Jews who come to the same realization. So there's only one group of beings in the universe about which this would be true, which Paul says is that they would actually stop the crucifixion and not have crucified Jesus if they knew it was going to create salvation from death. And that's the powers that bring death into the world, the supernatural powers, the demons who like death in the world and don't want to stop it. So when you put all of that together, it tends to look like Paul's talking about cosmic beings. Now, On the Historicity of Jesus, I score this flat, a 50-50. 50-50 that he means earthly powers or that he means demonic powers. So I don't use this as evidence for mythicism. What I do point out is that it's not evidence for historicity because it's too vague. And it's unfortunate. Like, so if Jesus did exist, it's unfortunate that Paul chose to write in this incredibly vague and suspicious way that doesn't allow us to tell what he's talking about. I think it does through the arguments I was pointing out before. But as far as if you want to defend historicity, you can't do it from this verse because you can't prove what he's talking about. What he's talking about is too vague. You can't nail it down to an actual earthly historical event. And that's a lot of passages of Paul are like that. It's suspiciously vague. So that's why I argue in the book that is not evidence for historicity. It's also not evidence for mythicism because we can't conclusively tell what this verse is doing.
You also talk a bit about the letter to the Hebrews, and you bring up a heavenly high priest. But it also says, it claims that Jesus was a member of the order of Melchizedek. So how does that work with him being a heavenly high priest?
Yeah, well, there is no order of Melchizedek, right? That's not a thing. Okay. So the question is, and this is in Hebrew, so the question is, what are they talking about? Now that they're quoting a verse that talks about an order of Melchizedek, but it comes from the Old Testament, but it's also vague as to what that's referring to because there's no actual Melchizedek priesthood. In fact, in the Old Testament, Melchizedek is not a Jewish priest at all. He's a priest of, well, basically a pagan priest. But he's one who acknowledges, there's a famous scene where he acknowledges the authority of Yahweh or whatever and blesses one of the patriarchs and so on. But what we get when we look at the Melchizedek literature outside the New Testament, there was a lot of Jewish speculation as to who the hell is this Melchizedek? What is this order of Melchizedek? We don't know what this is. And we have some of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. We have it in some other literature. I cite all the scholarship on Melchizedek studies. There's been a lot of stuff on this. But the general thing that you get is that Melchizedek is some sort of cosmic figure, might even be another name for Michael, or the archangel of many names. And so he's some sort of celestial being that serves God in some fashion. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Melchizedek scroll, as it's so called, there's Melchizedek leads some sort of legion of angels down from heaven to end the world. And so Melchizedek is this weird cosmic figure. So that doesn't help us either way. So historicists can't appeal to it. Like at best, they could say, well, maybe Christians thought Jesus was the incarnation of the celestial Melchizedek. That's entirely possible. But if that's the case, once you've gotten that far, well, where do you find them even landing on Earth here at all? So that's the step that you've got to go, the extra step, right? Anyway, for people who are curious about this and want to dive into it further, I have the whole section with cited scholarship on the historicity of Jesus about this weird Melchizedek attribution. What does it mean exactly, and how would it be interpreted on either theory, mythicism or historicity?
You also talk about the letter of Clement to the Corinthians. It also mentions Jesus being a high priest of some kind. Do you think that the author of Clement read Hebrews or the other way around? Or
that's often discussed. No one's really come to a conclusion on that, and neither have I. There are actually direct quotations between them, right? So, or near quotations in any case, to the point that one had to be using the other, or they're both using some other common source text that we don't have. And I haven't seen any demonstration of any one of those hypotheses being more likely than the other, so I really don't know. I'm fairly certain, and I make a strong case, along with several other scholars, that both these letters were written in the early 60s AD. not after, as is often thought. So they're written around the exact same time, First Clement and Hebrews. So they could have been quoting each other, they could have been using each other, or they could have been using common lore, common teaching between them.
Why do you date it to the 60s AD?
Well, both books, First Clement and Hebrews, there are passages in them where there's an argument that would be slam dunked if the Jewish war had happened, because it would prove every point that they're trying to prove, but they don't use it. So in Hebrews, the author of Hebrews is trying to convince Jewish Christians that have left, to stop being Torah observant. He's trying to convince them to not go back. And so he has this big, long, elaborate, multi-chapter argument about why the temple cult no longer works. But the one argument that he never uses is that it doesn't exist, right? That would be the most obvious thing. Well, you can't rely on the temple cult. It's gone. They got nuked in the war. That would be the obvious argument. But no, the idea that the temple cult isn't even available to go back to doesn't occur to the author, which means that wasn't an available thing at that time. That means the temple cult was still active to go back to. So that means the author of Hebrews had to have been written, the author of Hebrews had to be writing before the Jewish war. Now, First Clement, his whole thing is to try and explain there was like a rebellion, a sort of coup within the church at Corinth, where younger people basically took over deposed the elders and tried to take over the community. Now, we don't actually know what the fight was that led to that, just that it occurred. And Clement writes this long homily that he wants read out into the church to try and persuade them to step down and let the elders resume control. He never gets into the whatever ideological debate it was between them. He just wants order restored. And so he has this long extended argument, multi-chapter argument about how rebellion is bad and you should never do that. And it always ends badly. And he goes through giving examples and examples and examples. But there's one example that's not there is the Jewish war, which would have been obvious argument, right? It's like, well, look, the Jews rebelled against the Romans and look, they lost their country and their temple. Right. So for him to not use that argument is ridiculous. It's not even possible. And there are other examples in First Clement where there are opportunities where if he'd mentioned the war, it would have slam dunked his argument. So there's no way he would ignore it unless it hadn't happened yet. That would be the only way he would leave it out. So that's I give all those examples on the historicity of Jesus. If you want to look through all the items where I think if you put all these things together, there's no way First Clement was written after the Jewish war, and it was written after Paul was dead. So early 60s is the only date left.
I'd like to go back to the testimonium. We talked about that a bit during the first video.
Right.
There are arguments that the post-Eusebian testimoniums reflect an original text. Like somebody would use Jerome and say, oh, look at Jerome's testimonium. It sounds more realistic. As Josephus not portraying Jesus as a Messiah, or maybe some very late text like I think it's Agapius that mentions a more reasonable version of the testimonium. Yeah. And some will even use I think it's Michael Viserian, something like that. Could you explain why none of that works?
Right, that's complicated. So this is the Pines hypothesis, and it came out. It was usually called the Arabic testimonium. So it goes through Syriac to Arabic. It was Wheely would prove that later, but it has some like fixed phrasing, sort of say like believed to be the Christ rather than was the Christ, and some other aspects like that make it sound more something that a Jew would write. When you actually look, so the thing is that Eusebius quotes this passage in 3 different books, 3 different voluminous encyclopedic works that he wrote, not just in one place, but in 3. So, and in all 3, the version is the same. So usually what the argument is that somehow someone has a version that goes back earlier than that, but it's all based on the assumption that someone changed Eusebius's text. But that's impossible because that means they would have to have hunted down all across Europe all the copies of 3 completely different works and made the exact same changes to all of them, which is not credible at all. It's much more easy. You can show that Jerome made a simple change that he thought it sounded more Jewish if he would just put believed instead of that. And that later authors just kept borrowing that same idea. Because then it's just one change to one book leading causally to the next. Much easier to explain that causally. But there's other evidence. So Wheely did a whole study where she shows that the Arabic actually goes back to the Syriac. The Syriac actually goes back to Eusebius. And so she shows that you can show through analysis of, okay, this is a quotation borrowing from this text. This is a quotation borrowing from, because it has similar errors or similar changes in the text over time that are very specific to the languages. So you can show that it actually goes back to Eusebius, not to Josephus. And what people had hoped is that you could bypass Eusebius. That somehow someone looked at a manuscript of Eusebius and quoted it directly and wasn't getting it from from Josephus directly, and it wasn't looking at Eusebius. But Wheely proved that no, all of this stuff goes back to Eusebius, so you can't do that. Now Wheely still wanted to argue that it was still more authentic, right? She wanted to argue that her argument was that, well, okay, it indisputably goes back to Eusebius, okay, not Josephus, but maybe Eusebius's passage was doctored, and that these other versions represent a more authentic version of the Testimonium. That doesn't work either, because that requires the massive conspiracy manuscript hunt across Europe to find all the manuscripts of 3 completely different treatises of Eusebius and change them all exactly the same way. So her thesis makes no sense either. But she's the one who documented the evidence that conclusively showed the Pines thesis is false. The Arabic does not come from Josephus. It definitely derives from a Syriac translation of Eusebius.
What led you to the conclusion that 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, which mentioned the Jews killing Jesus and the wrath of God has come, must be an interpolation?
Yeah, and I'm not the only one to do that. It's a lot of scholars have come to that conclusion before I even came up to the scene. But
yeah, I'm aware.
But they're right, of course. On the historicity of Jesus, I do have a section where I actually show the probabilistic argument, how you can do a Bayesian analysis of this, and how I came to this conclusion. But it's the same reason other scholars have done, is that the way the passage talks about the Jews completely contradicts the way Paul himself talks about the Jews throughout the rest of his treatise, whereas it sounds exactly like 2nd century Christianity talking about the Jews. And then the other aspect, of course, is that he says that the passage says that the wrath of God has come upon them at last, in finality. So, which isn't true of the Jews of Judea, unless whoever wrote that is getting wrong when Paul wrote, right? Because the Jewish war hadn't happened yet. Paul dies long before the Jewish war. Jewish war and the destruction of the temple represents the wrath of God coming upon them. And that's also a 2nd century talking point that we find among Christians about how that's the wrath of God coming upon the Jews. And that's why we have to jump to Christianity now. So both of those pieces of that look exactly like 2nd century Christian rhetoric, but neither of those things are things Paul himself could have said. Even if he wanted to say something negative about the Jewish elite in Judea, he would have written a completely different passage than that. So, and if you take that out, also the flow of his argument stays the same. So there's no reason to believe in its authenticity. So there's nothing for its authenticity, while there's plenty of evidence against its authenticity. When you add it all up, the probability that those 2 lines are authentic are near zero.
There's another text that is a well-known forgery, the Doctrine of Avid. And what I find fascinating about it is that when it mentions Governor Albinus, which the translator of the text noted in a footnote that's Governor Albinus and Josephus, there's a chronological issue that he's writing 25 years after the emperor is dead, because it claims that, he's writing to the Emperor Tiberius, but he wasn't governor until much later.
Right. I don't know this text, so you're the first. This is the first I've heard this, but keep going.
Well, there's something strange in there that it almost looks to me like Jesus ben Ananus is being confused with Jesus by the forger.
I see.
And that's why he tossed the Governor Albinus in there.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I could see that. I don't like I said, I haven't studied that, so I can't assess it,
Okay.
can't evaluate that. But that is intriguing. It's worth looking into.
So would you say that because the Gospels are repurposing characters like Jesus ben Ananas and several others, including Homeric epics, Old Testament stories,
Moses, Elijah, yeah, right.
I noticed that in your book you use that to show that there's an increased probability based on that evidence too, that Jesus didn't exist, and that the Gospels are not good evidence that Jesus existed because they are re-engineering older stories and applying them to Jesus.
I mean, only in the abstract sense, because I do that with the Rank-Raglan thesis, but the Rank-Raglan model. But the real point there is trying to find a metric for how mythologized Jesus is. So all of that evidence points to the same conclusion, that he was heavily mythologized right out of the gate. And that puts him in a reference class in which there are fewer historical people than mythical people. So that's how that actually operates. And that's what I use for the prior probability. But in chapter 10, when I go into the Gospels, my final conclusion is that once you've taken that data point, once you've taken the point that you've conclusively proven the Gospels heavily mythologized Jesus, finding more examples of mythologization of Jesus doesn't increase that at all. It has no further effect. So you could keep going, find hundreds and hundreds of examples, even more than I found. It won't change the probability because we've already gotten past the threshold where he's in the classification of the most mythologized people in history. So more mythology doesn't make a difference. So the idea of going in and finding you could say, for instance, well, there's a lot of borrowing from Homer. Let's put it that. I have a paragraph on that. None of my arguments depend on that. So you don't. I've run into people say well, your conclusion is false because you rely on Dennis MacDonald and the Homeric thesis. And I don't actually. You can pull that completely out of the book, and it has no effect on the probabilities whatsoever. And that's an example of people who don't actually read the book and aren't interested in dealing with it. But I just want to caution that just pointing out specific examples of borrowing, if you were to try and argue they don't exist, it's not necessarily going to change the conclusion because we're still left with a heavily mythologized figure. But it is interesting to see how they're mythologizing him. Where are they getting these stories and these ideas? And it is obvious that they're updates of Moses and they're updates of Elijah. They're improvements on Homeric mythology. And intentionally, they want this to be represent better values than the Homeric epics. Their hope and goal is to replace the Homeric epics as the centerpiece of their religion, their religious culture. So that's why they're borrowing these stories and fixing them, making them better, making them more Christian.
So do you think that Jesus originally, before Paul, was basically the same character as, say, Michael or Metatron?
Oh, I mean, certainly my personal belief is more probably than not, he was believed to be comparable to those figures. He was some sort of celestial super being an archangel from the beginning of time. Now, whether he was literally actually Michael, the angel Michael, or believed to be at that time, one of the many names that he had would have been Michael or the Metatron. I lean in that direction, but I don't think it can be conclusively proved. And I do have an article on my blog for that, for people who are interested. I was surprised, actually. On the historicity of Jesus, I have a footnote where I say it looks like they were thinking that Jesus was Michael, but I can't prove this, so I'm not going to do anything with it. Later, I read a whole book, a peer-reviewed monograph by someone who makes a really strong case. It's still not a conclusive case, but it's a really strong case that the earliest Christians and later Christians even always assumed that Michael was the secret identity of Jesus, that he always was the archangel Michael, because Michael is the high priest of God's celestial temple, and he has a lot of other roles that Jesus is also assigned. So it makes sense that they always thought that he was Michael, and that they kept that as a secret. And we know they did that because even the Dead Sea sect was very big on keeping angelic names secret, angelic identities secret. That was a big deal. And we have this in Ignatius, one of the earliest Christian writings after the New Testament. He has a brief remark for this. So there's all this really important angelology, but I can't talk about it in this letter because it's all secret stuff. So there's tantalizing evidence that one of the secrets of the Christian religion was that Jesus all along was the incarnation of the Michael angel, or the angel Michael. And similarly, the Metatron, for people who don't know, that there's evidence that even Jewish authors thought Michael and the Metatron were the same. There's not conclusive, so sometimes the Metatron is identified with different angels, but we do have evidence that some Jewish authors identified Michael and Metatron. So that's why it would make sense to name them both in that context.
So let's shift this to dying, rising God parallels from other cultures to Jesus. There are some, I would like you to talk about some of these terrible parallels that people have come up. And you've debunked them many times before.
Yeah. There's a lot of bad parallelomania out there, which is annoying because there are legitimate ones. And once most people get exposed to the bogus ones, and then they just assume it's all bogus. So it's hard. You have to de-educate people. Say, oh, no, you've heard some bad things. So what's wrong? The concept is correct, but here to get to the correct stuff, it's much more work. The worst ones are the Horus parallels, right? So, and I recently, I've been getting a lot of questions lately about the Zeitgeist film again. I don't know why this is going around suddenly. I mean, it's how many decades old is that thing? But that's where you find it a lot. Also in Religulous, people who still watch the Bill Maher movie, he uses the same material because he didn't fact check it. All these parallels between Jesus and Horus are bogus. Forget them. Don't even go there. There are parallels between Jesus and Osiris. They aren't as many, and they aren't the fantastical ones. Like they didn't both have 12 disciples. They weren't both born on December 25th. These weren't even true of Jesus in the beginning, right? Like assigning the birthday of the 25th of December to Jesus happened centuries after Christianity began. It wasn't a belief in the origins of Christianity. So it's not even useful. Even if Horus and Osiris were born on December 25th, it would be meaningless for the origins of Christianity because Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, even in Christian myth at that time. But also, Osiris and Horus weren't born on December 25th. So they were born in summer. They actually have, in the Egyptian calendar, they have a summer birthday. Anyway, so yeah, there's if you run into those kinds of things, I recommend people go find a peer-reviewed study. Don't trust the internet stuff. And that's part of what I've done on the historicity of Jesus is a peer-reviewed example, where I discuss the ones that actually hold up, what parallels what gods and all that. There's a chapter coming out. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's about this, the dying and rising gods, and it's going to be in a new John Loftus volume. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of it. But you can find it on John Loftus's website. It's he's written about. It's coming out. I don't think it's out yet, but it's almost out. But I've seen an advanced copy of this chapter in the Dying and Rising Gods, and it is the best chapter I've ever seen written on the subject. I mean, it's peer-reviewed quality, and it covers all the arguments pro and con of this, the apologetics, and why the real scholarship isn't taken down by the apologetic defenses. So I would look for that. Look for the new John Loftus book and that one chapter in it. There are other good chapters in that book coming out too, but the one about the dying and rising gods, I'm super stoked about it. So it's a really good one.
Yeah, they'll say the people that make these parallels between Horus and Jesus will say things like, "Hour sounds like Horus, 12 Horuses."
Yeah,
there's even this one very absurd claim that this depiction that shows the 12 judges or something like that. At least they claim that's what it is, and it sounds like 12 disciples, and Osiris is standing right there, and Horus is standing right next to him. Oh, Osiris is sitting down, excuse me, and Horus is standing right next to him. And the comparison is made that, you see, that's where they got Jesus. That's where they got the idea that Jesus said, "You have to go through me to get to the Father."
No, I hate these. These are terrible. And I seem to recall that image. It's like one of the pyramid etchings, but it's there aren't even 12 in the scene. But no, yeah. Even if there were, it wouldn't be relevant. It's just no connection. It's tea leaf reading. I find like it's a lot of people who have this sort of fantastical conspiracy theory mindset. They just find every single pattern that is conceivable. It reminds me of a time when I went to the British Museum to look at a coin and got photographs and published them in Skeptical Inquirer to refute Jerry Vardaman's claim that there are microscopic letters on these coins. And these letters were carved into the coins with special diamond tip tools at minting. So they were actually minted, and there was actually all this government propaganda that he was finding tons and tons of texts on coins. And I went and looked, and when you look at his drawings, he never shows photographs. You look at his drawings, and he's finding tons and tons of letters scattered all over, and some of them are like W's and J's. And for people who know anything about ancient Latin, are probably laughing already right now because there was W and the J didn't exist as letters back then. But whatever. But so he did this. But when I went and looked at the coin, it was just it's a bronze coin. It was just patina. It was just the green patinated rust that basically it's accumulated on top of it, and it's cracked. And they're just random cracks. And he just saw all these words in the random cracks. And that's what I see is happening here is like people find like the etymological thing, like, oh, it sounds like this, therefore that's the etymological connection. It's like no one even thought like that in the ancient world, much less does that, they're just looking for any pattern they can find. And if they can make anything fit anything, then it's almost as if God has told them that therefore there is a meaningful connection between them. They have no discernment. They can't tell the difference between random cracks in a coin and an actual bunch of letters. Right. It's the same kind of mindset. And people got to avoid this. It's why it's important to check peer-reviewed studies instead of amateur internet stuff.
And there's another one I would like you to discuss and why it's very wrong, this ridiculous theory that you probably discussed it before, maybe even in the same article that you were debunking the Horus nonsense. There are a lot of people out there that say, oh, Israel. It sounds like ISIS, Ra, and El.
Yeah, I don't talk about that. I mean, I talk about some other examples of this bad etymology, but not that one. But yes, that's one of many. I mean, that's completely made up. I mean, it's not how even words work in the ancient world anyway. But also, I mean, we know how Israel derives from the Hebrew for struggles with God, and why we have a whole mythological story as to why that was the name, or at least why they believed and taught that was the name. And there's no logical reason Isis and Ra would be in there. No, it's crazy pattern matching. It's cracks in the coin again.
Yeah, they'll also compare the Ankh to the cross, and
that's a weird one because crosses weren't a thing in early Christianity. This is another example of like December 25th. It's like you can't explain the origins of Christianity with things that weren't even in Christianity at the time. So like the idea of the cross, that comes much later. The first we hear discussions of the cross as even being a Christian thing is late 2nd century. And at that time, they're not talking about the cross as the crucifix. They're talking about the cross as a symbol. And they're using examples of it as like, the mast of a ship and an anchor, and all these things symbolize salvation in various respects. And so they're not even talking about an actual cross, which it wouldn't be a cross. It would be a T in any event. The crucifixions were usually vine props. So it's patibulum and crux. So it's a T formation. You have a upright pole, and then you take the block and you just notch it into the upright pole. It wouldn't even make any sense for it to have an extender up through the top. But that's why like the most authentic depictions of the crucifixion show T-shaped. And I think there's even a reference to crucifixion using the tau form. I think Lucian talks about crucifixes took the form of the tau, which is the Greek T, which is it has no top. It's just a flat. I mean, it's a proper T. But anyway, the cross wasn't a thing, and it wasn't until another 100 years later, like 3rd or 4th century, that crucifixes become a thing, a symbol. But during all this time, yes, the Ankh is one of these things. And there's actually crosses, many cross-like shapes, the Ankh being an example. The X is an example. Various different, that's a cross, right? Crosses have mystical meaning in many religions going back thousands of years. So the idea of assimilating a crucifix to an already existing cross symbol, well, you'd expect that to happen because the idea already existed. It predated Christianity. but they didn't invent the crucifixion based on it. That doesn't make any logical sense.
All right, so let's shift back to Josephus. And I also want to throw Paul in there too while we're at it. There's a really this is one of the worst theories I've ever heard of. Outside of the idea that all of Christianity came from Egypt,
Right.
which we just took care of that, and you've taken care of that many times.
And for people that are interested, I have Kemetic. I can't remember the title of the blog, but it's where I talk about Kemetic religion, which Kemetic. Just search that word on my blog at richardcarrier.info. And yeah, and I go through many examples of this kind of stuff that you're talking about. And I'm not going to go into debunking all the 1,000 weird things they say, but I give an example of each category of thing. And so you can see where these things go wrong for people that are interested in that.
I'll toss a link in the description.
Cool.
So now that being said, there's a theory that, and this is based on Acts, largely based on Acts parallels with Josephus Flavius. The claim that Josephus is Paul.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's Eisenman, right?
No, that's not Eisenman.
Oh, who is that? Oh, that's the other guy. I can't think of his name right now.
Ralph Ellis.
Ellis, right. Yeah, I confused those two guys because they were both kind of the two crazy people at a conference I went to once, but they were both at one conference one time, making similar claims. But yeah, Ellis makes this claim. It's tea leaf reading. It's more cracks in the coin. There's no basis for this. It's just wild, what do you call multiple comparisons fallacy, where you're just looking for any pattern match you can find and creating an incredibly complicated conspiracy theory board with all the red string everywhere. It's not a valid historical methodology.
Yeah, it'll say, "Oh, the ship. They were on the same ship. They were shipwrecked in the Adriatic Sea. But Josephus was chasing this guy called Jesus, son of Gamala."
Yeah, I mean, just made out of whole cloth, right? There's no such story, but yeah, I mean, both Ellis and Eisenman do this. They invent these massively elaborate narratives on nothing, like just random pieces of data that they just connect together. But there's no actual such narrative. It's just they've completely concocted it and are totally convinced that the narrative they've invented is true, even though you can find it in no ancient text as written.
Yeah, and there are some people out there who are really, really dogmatic about thinking that this guy is the same person. I was like, okay, I think for something like that to even be remotely true, somebody would have to say all Paul's letters are forgeries. It doesn't make any sense that Josephus is writing as Paul.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, no, of course. You would have to say that Josephus forged them, which then gets you into the at-will thesis and the Paizo thesis, which at-will thesis is just a new version of. So right, no, it's that's all crank stuff. There's a reason none of that stuff gets published under peer review. It doesn't meet the standards of the field of proper logical historical methodology.
Yeah, and what he does is there's a story in the autobiography where Jesus, son of Gamala, warned Matthias to warn Josephus that, hey, the Jews are going after you. You need to get the hell out of Dodge. And he does. And what he does is he says, like, wait a minute. The guy that's coming to arrest Josephus is named Jesus, son of Saphius. And the guy that warned Josephus through his father is also named Jesus. Therefore, they're the same person. He's warning Josephus that he's coming to arrest him.
Everybody named Jesus is the same person, right?
Yeah, he keeps going with that.
Yeah.
And then he shifts to he takes the New Testament literally that Jesus was a king, and therefore, okay, we have to go find his coins. And there's this guy named. There's this guy named. Okay, so there's this guy.
We're about ready to wrap, but
okay.
So you can get to it, but keep going.
Yeah, there's this guy. He equates. In one point in Josephus, Josephus calls his Atis Isis, Izas.
Or at least it's in the manuscript as such.
Right. And in the translation that I have, in the my physical copy of Josephus, and in the Kindle version, it just doesn't use that. It just says Zates. He says, "Oh, that sounds like Jesus." So he's and what he does is, and this is the worst of his methodology, I think. He uses the Gospels to figure out which person in Josephus is the same person. Each person that is parallels the Gospel in some way, he assumes they're the same as each other.
Right.
It almost sounds like it's like, okay, let's use Josephus to figure out when the Gospels are lying, and use the Gospels to figure out when Josephus is lying, which is circular.
Yeah. I just don't have the patience for that kind of stuff.
Right. So, okay, yeah, I think that does wrap it up. I appreciate you for covering that. I know it's cringeworthy.
Yeah.
But I do want my audience to understand why it doesn't work either. Like, there's a lot of people that believe that nonsense.
Yeah, it's and for people who want to know the why, like the methodological reason why, and that is where the article I did about chematism covers that. Like, I intended to give examples, but each example illustrates a methodological principle of what they're doing wrong. These kinds of arguments, what's going wrong there that doesn't make any logical sense, versus how would you do it correctly? What is a valid historical methodology? It doesn't get you the same results as these. It's none of the methodology you describe there is a valid way of reasoning in history, for obvious reasons. I mean, you could make up any story you wanted if you get to do things like that. And that's why it's rejected in history as a field.
I think the moral of that story is be careful with parallels, because it may not be exactly what you think.
Right. No, true. It means you need a more falsifiable methodology for determining if parallels exist. How do you determine that? I have a small section on that in Proving History, where I talk about what is the difference between random parallels that don't mean anything, they're just coincidental, and parallels that do mean something, and how do you tell the difference between them? And I show even a Bayesian model of how you tell the difference between valid and invalid parallelism. And so we do need a valid logical method like that to tell the difference, because it's so easy. If you're just going to allow any connection you can make through any leap to matter, then you can construct anything you want. And because you're going to find, when you have millions of words, as we do in the ancient Greek literary corpus, the number of connections you can make randomly is, practically infinite, right? So you need some sort of methodology to avoid multiple comparisons fallacy, which is, for people who want to know, look that up. It tells you what's going on here.
All right, then. Thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah.
So don't forget to like and subscribe, everybody. Check the links in the description. I'll include the links to Dr. Carrier's website, his Amazon page. I will also throw a link in there to the article he did on Chemiticism, and why that theory just is very bad, doesn't work. Including his other article on the... actually, no, I'm not sure. I'm thinking of an article. It's probably the same article.
Well, there's the one on the Arabic testimonium you might.
Oh, yeah.
So that touches on what we talked about today.
I'll throw that in there as well. Mm-hmm. And check out the Patreon, PayPal links in the description as well, in case anybody wants to donate, or donate through YouTube live streams in the future, or through YouTube premieres, or become members. There's a join button next to the About section on the channel. You can click on that as well. So thanks for watching. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.